Folks, welcome to this episode of the Fabricators Coach podcast. We're back again with Chase Busenbark, our certified business broker, expert slash guru, and knower of all things related to business sales. Chase, welcome back. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for holding that hat so high above my head. I appreciate that.
Well, you've I think the last couple of episodes we've really gotten some super information on this whole, starting the process of selling, making that decision to sell, things you got to be ready for, decisions you've got to make on the early part of the process, and then what that whole sales process looks like. I think that's been really helpful to our listeners. Today, we want to get into what I think is probably a core issue and probably the most, at least in my mind, from my experience, most contentious issue, and that's what's this business worth? I run into so many business owners, small business owners that think their businesses are worth a whole lot more than they really are. This is a podcast, obviously, for countertop Fab Shop business owners. You deal with this industry and others, and I'm wondering this issue of not really having a good sense of what your business is worth, is that unique to this industry, or is that pretty common with small business owners?
Ed, that's a good question. I would say that the majority of business owners across every market typically think that the business is worth more than what it actually is. You come across those businesses every once in a while, that business owners that are surprised at the valuation given back to them. Like, oh, I had no idea. I do have a nice sellable business here. But yeah, for generally speaking, for the most part, I would say that they kind of are overinflating the value of the business.
What do you, and I see the same thing too, obviously. What do you think the main reason is for that perspective, that difference in what we think it's worth versus what it's really worth? Any idea what drives that from your experience?
A business owner knows how hard they've worked to get it to the point that they're at. They know what they've gone through, the sacrifices that they've made, the good employees that have quit and they've had to fulfill those shoes, especially in the fabrication industry, where one day they might be selling the product, the next day measuring it, and then the next day installing it, potentially even fabricating it but even for the larger business owners that are above, that aren't doing that so much, not doing the full owner operated situations, but then just from the management standpoint, in the fabrication industry, it's very hands-on. There's a lot of chain pieces to make up that entire chain. And if there's one big key missing link there, it's got to be fulfilled to get that kitchen complete, right? So
yeah, it's a fairly complex industry, no question. I describe this industry to people who aren't familiar with it as an intersection between retail, wholesale B2B. We've got manufacturing, we've got construction, we've got design elements, just all sorts of things that come together that you just don't see in many other industries. So yeah, it's complex. And I think, as you say, people just put their blood, sweat, and tears into it for so long, man, it's got to be worth something, right?
absolutely. And to kind of hit on that a little bit further is just the actual value of the business versus what the potential, a business owner always sees that potential. Well, if a guy were to do this, it can make it that much better. It could be 10% better. If you saved a little bit on the materials that you purchased and bought in bulk, you could save a little bit there. But at the end of the day, businesses are typically sold off the actuals and not off the potential. So,
Yeah.
and that's how they're financed and as well. And that's how lenders look at the business too.
So let's dive into the valuation a little bit. Certainly, I'm not an expert. I've been around this in a number of roles. What are as the professional business broker, what are the major factors that determine the value of say a countertop fab shop that somebody wants to sell?
Absolutely. So before we get into the really, really hard details of multiples and how to value and looking at the cash flow and debt to service, things like that, you've always heard the saying, something is worth what somebody's willing to sell it for and what somebody else is willing to buy it for. And at the end of the day in business, that can really hold true to a lot of people because you never know on the other side's situation and how it may benefit them. You know, it may benefit them from a tax perspective, or it may benefit them because they've worked for a corporation for so long and now they're actually ready to go out and buy their own business. So I always tell business owners right up front, you know, I like to do a market price evaluation. So just, you know, standard valuation of what the business is worth to determine what I think the business is worth.
Okay.
Now, ultimately, I'm willing to list the business for what the business owner thinks it's worth if we're within reason, right? I mean,
Right.
we got to be similar because you know, if we're not within reason, I don't want to waste the business owner's time, nor do I want to waste my own.
Yep.
And at the end of the day, regardless of what I think the business is worth or what seller thinks the business is worth, the market's going to determine the value of your business. And the one true way to do that is to begin to get some offers on the table. So let's see what kind of offers we get, and you know, we'll see if it's acceptable to you as the owner in the position and the situation that you're in as well. So get some offers on the table. I can't, you know, market the business or anything without the business owner's express consent, and that typically comes in the form of listing agreement.
Yeah.
That's one of the first things that I'll kind of get into, and yeah, in looking at what is the value of this business, because at the end of the day, regardless of what I think it's worth or the seller thinks it's worth, let's find out. Let's find out what it's worth.
Okay. So as you go do your estimate of what the business is worth, you know, certainly the ultimate value is what somebody's willing to pay for it. But one of the factors the objective factors that you go through to figure out, you know, guy's got a $3 million a year Fab Shop and he's netting 10%. How do you figure? And let's say he owns his building and his equipment, may have some notes on equipment, may even have a mortgage on the building. How do you sort out what is that business worth $3 million or is it some number less than that? How do you figure that out?
Right. Yeah. So kind of getting into those a little bit more detailed financials now. I'll first begin with looking at the profit and loss reports, the balance sheets, the tax returns. And I use a couple different systems where I can actually see what lenders have and what the business is actually closed for. So through that, it's a comparable to the industry that we're in, and I can see ultimately, you know, the inventory amounts, what the EBITDA multiples are, what the seller's discretionary earnings multiples are, and then kind of compare that to the gross revenue and the profit margins of the business that I'm working with as well, right? So that's kind of one good overview from a comparable standpoint.
All right. So you
Now,
used a couple of terms in there. I want to make sure we don't miss those real quick for folks who aren't familiar with them. One of them is a term called EBITDA. What is EBITDA?
absolutely. So EBITDA is an acronym spelled out. So earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So let's look at the net operating income of the business, and then let's figure out what the business is from an EBITDA value worth, depending on say seller's situation. So you know, you're going to add back any depreciation values, and this gets me into a whole nother topic called normalizing the actuals of the income statement. So I'll look at those profit and loss reports or those tax returns, both typically combined, and and look at the actuals to say, what are some add backs here? Let's normalize this and let's figure out what this true business value is worth from an EBITDA standpoint and the seller's discretionary earnings standpoint, right? So
Okay.
when doing so, they may have some discretionary expenses within the business that the new buyer may not, you know, have. So
You have an example maybe of some of those?
yeah, absolutely. Your wife doesn't work in the business, but you're paying her car insurance and her gas card, and your 16-year-old son's, you know, vehicle insurance, and you guys go on a family vacation, and it costs $5,000, and it's, you know, or $10,000, and it's a business expense. So
Gotcha. Yeah.
yeah, so to take some of those things, but there's also a fine line there, because you can't go over the top with those add backs, because a lot of times lenders, if you can't really justify them, the lender at the end of the day doesn't want to say, yeah, let's add it back in there. They would rather be on the safe side. So actually reporting the true financials, that 3 years prior to selling the business is going to be more important than trying to figure out all these add backs, because they may not be justified at the end of the day.
And so part of this kind of gets into the fact that, all right, when you look at a P&L statement for a business, we all know as business owners, we're going to make decisions that hopefully improve the business, improve the performance of the business, but we also want to try to minimize our tax impact as much as we can. And that's why this normalization you're talking about with, vacations, car payments, whatever, things that may or may not be okay tax-wise from IRS perspective, but will work out in favor of the business from a tax point, are things we kind of need to clean up so that a prospective buyer and also the lender, the bank itself, can understand what's really going on in the business. So you're just trying to kind of clean all that up and balance out what an owner may have done to try to minimize tax impact.
That's right. Yeah. And so to even give you an actual example of how to minimize that tax impact, no seller wants to pay more taxes than what they have to, and that goes for everyone. So let's take an example that, let's say you have add backs of say $20,000 for easy numbers. So that's what you're trying to write off that may not actually be expenses through the business, or you're trying to write those expenses off because you have a different business and that other business isn't very profitable, but this is the true moneymaker, with making the profit. Let's take that 20,000 for example and say that saves you 25% in taxes at the end of the year. So we're going to take $5,000 that saved you in hard money. Well, let's say now whenever it comes to a valuation standpoint, I'd say just a simple 3 times multiple, that 20,000 is now worth $60,000. So you're comparing the 5,000 times the 3 years, 15,000, compared to the actual profit, showing that revenue from an IRS perspective of 20,000 times the 3 years. So you're comparing the 15,000 to a $60,000 valuation difference the last 3 years when it comes to selling your business.
All right, so now we're getting into the concept of multiples, and to me, from my experience, the two big factors that really the two numbers you look at for business valuation are what's that EBITDA, what's that net earnings of the business that's normalized, and then what multiple do you apply to that? So we're kind of into that multiple arena. How is the multiple used with the EBITDA to determine value of the business for folks who aren't familiar with that process?
Yeah. So, whenever it comes to those multiples, the EBITDA, for instance, those multiples still can vary. So let's take the same industry. We have a granite shop, a granite fabrication company, and one business is making 150,000 profit at the end of the day, while the other's making, say, $750,000 profit. Well, they're the same industry, right? Those multiples are still drastically different because it's going to still be based off of that profit margin. In this industry, it's a very, very asset heavy industry. You have to have a lot of it. A business owner that is doing more volume typically has more an asset volume. They have all the machines. They're drilling out the concrete, so they have a lot of leasehold improvements per se. Even though they may own the real property as well, but it takes a lot of preparation to get that fab shop up and running. So they have a lot of asset value on the front side, and then also they may have a lot of inventory value as well. So businesses, generally speaking, are sold. Those multiples are based off the assets included as well. It's not very common that you're going to see a multiple plus what the actual assets are that produce that income, right? The assets are what produce that income. So you either have the asset value or you have the multiple value, which whenever you're selling a business, hopefully outweighs that asset value. That's when you know that you're in a lot better position than just what the assets worth alone.
Okay. And the way the multiple is used on working the valuation from that formula, you're taking the EBITDA times a number to come up with the value of the business. What are typical multiples that you see in this industry?
They vary, they vary drastically. I mean, you can say probably typical EBITDA multiples are 3 to 5, and with owner's compensation, say, all the way from 1.5 up to 3 or 4.
Mhm.
So they do vary quite a bit. And at the end of the day, it really comes down to not only just the multiple, but how is the business from a cash flow standpoint whenever a buyer goes to purchase the business. And now you're taking into consideration what's the cash flow if I'm deducting the actual taxes out of the cash flow. What is the actual debt, which is the business, and how does that affect the debt to service ratio? So most of the
Gotcha.
time, a lender is going to want to be, no less than a 1.3, 1.4 debt to service ratio. That's just kind
So
of that.
so how do you calculate debt to service ratio in case somebody wants to do that for themselves with their own financials? How do you get to that 1.3, 1.4? What do you divide? What two factors are you dividing out?
For debt service ratio,
Yeah.
you're dividing out the business cash flow divided by the debt service after all the expenses,
Yeah.
and dividing it by the actual debt service. What am I paying a month, and or multiply it times 12 a year to, in comparisons to what that cash flow of the business produces.
So to use simple numbers, so my Clemson brain can calculate here. If we're looking for a ratio of 1.3, that would mean that for a business that has $100,000 a year in debt, you'd want to see profitability of 120, 130, 140,000 a year. Is that 1.3, 1.4 ratio? Is that what we're saying?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm actually looking at a business right here in front of me that I'm valuing this week, and the business cash flow is 2.5 million, and the business debt service is 1,350,000. So that's a debt service ratio of about a 1.9.
All right. And so those are things, a really favorable debt service ratio is going to help the multiple, right? Is that how that works, or is it used a different way?
How did you phrase that, Ed?
Well, all right. So if I've got the business you've got in front of you has a debt service ratio of 1.9,
Okay.
How does that impact the multiple? You've already got the EBITDA of the company. Does that debt to service ratio influence where you put the multiple, or is it even involved in that equation at all?
Yeah, it is involved, and from a broad, I said that you could use those multiples earlier, and I could see the history of what those multiples are within a certain industry, right? So
Okay.
it's very common even within the granite industry. Okay, an average multiple may vary between, let's say, 2 and 3, just to keep it really simple. But at the end of the day, if the cash flow doesn't work out, then that multiple may be affected as well, right? So
Okay.
so you can have a starting point. Let's have a starting number. Let's say, what is the cash flow, and let's put a multiple on it. But now let's work these numbers backwards to determine how fast am I going to pay this business off? What do I actually have to do to keep producing the numbers that it's producing? Let me look at it from a buyer's perspective, right? And I think as a seller, you should look at your business as that too. What would I be willing to pay for my business? Because I think a lot of business owners really think that the business it may just be a confusion. They may think it's a multiple of the gross revenue rather than the actual profit. They
Right.
may think so. It's not that they're trying to overinflate it. It's just maybe that you're just not 100% sure how the numbers actually work. They've never ran their business from a from a debt perspective to see, if I were to buy this business today, what would I be willing to purchase it for? And then how long can I begin to get my money back before I begin to, truly profit from the business? And
Yeah.
that's how any business has kind of got to be looked at from a deeper standpoint of, let's just take a multiple and, put it on the business, and that's what it's worth.
Understood. And that gets into the discussion. And we talked a little bit about this in the earlier episodes about, working on your business versus in it, making your business a vehicle that gets you to some exit strategy, helps you achieve some goal in life versus your business being a lifestyle, something that you eat, live, and breathe, most of your waking hours, most of your days, and there is no end result game plan. So obviously a business that's set up to operate as a vehicle, something that anyone who knows how to drive it can drive. If I've got a vehicle, my wife can drive it, my daughter can drive it, that kind of thing, versus something that I'm the only one that knows how to drive. And the analogy I use is if you look at your business, and if the owner of the business is like that tall pole in a tent, that tallest pole, if you pull the owner out, the tent collapses. Is that your business, or are there a lot of tall tent poles supporting the business? The owner pulls out, it has little effect on the tent. The tent stays up. It's kind of a simple, really simple analogy I use. But when we get into valuation, there's a profit of the business, EBITDA. We go through and normalize that as you talked about, and we take that and run it against a multiple that can be anywhere from, I've got a friend who is a CPA who actually ran a fab shop for a few years. And he says that what he has seen in his experience, multiples run between 3 and 6, which would mean you'd take a business with an EBITDA of $100,000 a year and multiply it by say 3 on the low end. That's business is worth $300,000 is one aspect of business value. I know there are other things you consider as well. But then we get into the discussion of, okay, how do you influence the multiple? If the range is from 2 to 4, 3 to 6, whatever it is, how does a business owner who wants to sell his or her business sometime down the road, how do they not just impact the profit of the business, the EBITDA, but how do they impact what that multiple is going to look like?
From a multiple standpoint, you're exactly right. You kind of hit on that 3 to 6 and that, but there are many. I guess you could say there are many different ways to impact that multiple. Like you had also just previously mentioned, you the owner operator and you're the long pole in the tent. Um, so depending on the size and the value of the actual business, you have the owner operated businesses that say hypothetically are profiting less than 300,000, that owner is probably going to be very involved. And then outside of that, once you start getting above those points, you're taking into consideration just the revenue trends, the true profitability of the business, and I kind of break that down with say 3 to 5 years side by side, and look at the numbers and the percentages next to it as well. And the larger the business is, more times than not, those buyers are going to really be analyzing it from that perspective. So
they're looking kind of at the historical performance trends of the company, not just revenue, not just profitability, but also things like debt to service ratios and other typical financial metrics. They're looking mainly at the numbers and not so much at the structure of the business. Is that because the business is large enough that to be that large and be successful, it has to have a certain amount of infrastructure that is independent of the owner? Say a $20 million business compared to a $2 or $3 million a year business, totally different infrastructure, totally different processes, procedures. Part of how that $20 million a year business got to that size from wherever it started was because it had all that built in, right?
Right. So it's all those things that kind of affect that multiple. And then at the end of the day, it's really putting those, so you may have a plan as a business owner to try and this business has other ways to make more money, so it has this potential and it has more potential, but really putting that potential to paper, if you will, is where it's really going to make a difference. So let's take your ideas and let's make it a reality. And now that reality becomes part of a better asking price for the business. And I actually just looked at a different business other than the one that I'm talking about today, and the guy does roughly $4 million a year in gross revenue, but he's got a mixture of his personal expenses, because he's got some rental property and he's got another business, and so he's kind of taking money from his profitable business in the granite countertop industry, and he's using that money to move it over towards another business, and he doesn't really have good books. He doesn't
Yeah.
have good profit and loss reports. So it's it's really hard to dissect his business from a true cash flow coin, or what is this business profiting right now, even though the business he's thinking it's making roughly $500,000 and $600,000 a year. It's a nice business. It's a profitable business. It's a business that's very sellable. So with that being said, um, just having clean financials again, and having that on paper. So what we're actually having to do is, and he's getting with his bookkeeper and kind of CPA to, he doesn't have a true CPA, but his bookkeeper to compile this, and maybe even get with the CPA to produce these documents so his business now is sellable. He's printing off the last 3 years of his bank statements, and more or less we're trying to create accurate profit and loss reports from that, right?
Wow, man, that's
Yep.
3 years worth transaction by transaction. That's a job and a half, man. That's tough.
It's going to take a lot of time, and it's
And he's going to do
be
that
really
while
expensive.
he's still running his business too. And this is an additional job he just put on himself, right?
I mean, you're exactly right. I think that to do it accurately, he needs to have his bookkeeper or a CPA. I think he's going to go get with an accountant to say, hey, how can we actually do this right to create
Yeah.
these financials? And then once those financials are created, there's got to be documentation of how they were created
Yep.
after that, because a buyer's going to say, well, where's the proof saying that where this information came from? So whether that's highlighting the bank statements and saying this number came from here, this number came from here, and so on and so forth, it's got to be documented where it's factual, where now a lender believes it, and then also a buyer is willing to believe it. Like I said, this is a very nice company. This is a business that's doing 4 million, roughly profiting $500,000-$600,000 a year, and the business isn't sellable until this is done.
And once all this is done, it'll be more sellable. But because the financials will have obviously come from a recreation of what's happened the last few years versus having had obviously clean books separating the businesses out for the last 3 years, then when a prospective buyer goes to look at it, it's going to make that prospective buyer question other things in the business. Well, the financials they're a little fuzzy here. Even after it's cleaned up, what else is fuzzy in the business? And then that lender, who, if the buyer, assuming is going to go through a bank or a lender of some type to borrow the money to help complete the transaction, that lender is going to have the same question too. And all that together is going to influence probably driving that multiple down below what it would have been if he'd had clean books and better bookkeeping practices for the last few years, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so keeping all your books clean, keeping your multiple businesses separate is important, not just from a management standpoint, knowing where you're making money, where you aren't, and helping you make good business decisions. But in the early part of this process, they've got to be able to convince you, the broker, of the fact that all this is being tracked properly and give you good, clean data to help make a good recommendation for business value. And then beyond that, it's got to go to a prospective buyer who says, yeah, I think it's probably worth something like that too. And then we've still got the lender that can come look at it and say, well, maybe not. So it's really, I think what I'm trying to do is hammer home the importance, because I've talked to businesses doing $8-10 million a year in revenue that do not do monthly P&Ls and don't do regular balance sheets. They'll do a tax return at the end of the year. CPA will do it, but if you don't have those regular monthly statements, the impact on your ability to sell your business and the impact on what you'll get from the sale of the business can be seriously impacted, can it?
That it absolutely can. Yes, it can. I mean, even if that business is making a certain amount and there's no justification for that, it's really going to make somebody uneasy. So, and if a buyer's uneasy and a lender's uneasy at the end of the day, um, depending on how much equity injection the buyer has, let's take the lender completely out of it. Let's say that, a buyer is in the most fortunate situation, um, and they have 100% of the ask, 100% of the asking price, which is never going to
He's just
happen,
going to write a
right?
check, right?
Yeah. Which the odds of this happening are like 0%.
Right,
But
right.
let's say that they did, they're still gonna want to give themselves, a safety net of say, and what is that number worth to them? Is that 10, 15, 20% off the asking price to say, well, if anything does go wrong because there is no true documentation here, I'm still going to be okay.
Yep. Okay.
And then that becomes the asking, that becomes the offer on the table, that person, that buyer.
Certainly. And the reality again is it's worth what somebody's willing to pay you for it. So one way a prospective seller can impact his multiple is to make sure we've got good, clean financials month by month back at least 3 years, preferably 5. The larger business, as you mentioned, you started getting into, 10, 8, 10, 15, $20 million size businesses. The buyer and the lender are going to look really heavily at those financials because the business is assumed to have a certain amount of infrastructure to continue without the owner, being integral to that. The smaller businesses, then you can be looking at both those financials and how well the business is structured to survive without the owner. And those are things that will impact the multiple. You were talking about future plans. One of the things that talking with Aaron Crowley in our previous episodes about his experience was his lender actually asked him to sit down and write out what the game plan was for his business for the next few years. What is the buyer going to have to do? Where is the buyer's opportunity? What are the things that if Aaron wasn't selling the business, he would continue to do over the next few years to grow the business? Because the lender wanted to understand kind of what the future of the business looked like in a sense. Mm-hmm. And that impacted his multiple. Gave the lender a lot of confidence. The buyer was already confident, gave the lender a lot of confidence in that case. One of the things that I do with shop owners is we, usually pretty early in the engagement, we start talking about what's the rest of this year look like, what's the next year look like, what do your long-term plans look like, where does the data come from to feed those plans. And so if a business owner wants to impact their multiple for selling a business, then these near-term and long-term plans and the data and the documentation for where those plans come from, what they're based off of, gets to be an important factor that sounds like that could also impact the multiple when you go to sell as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything really does. I mean, everything makes a difference at the end of the day. And what I like to do, from a business standpoint, a lot is I'll do that valuation, and then let's say work those numbers backwards, because you had mentioned, a lender wants to know that plan, and what is that business owner? What would they be doing? What would the seller be doing if they were to keep this business for the next 2 to 3 years? So, as a specialized broker in the industry, I think it really, it makes a difference. Me being specialized in this industry because I know the industry. I work with a lot of the lenders. And if I continue, to do more and more transactions and things begin to go smoothly, well, of course, they build confidence in that process with myself and vice versa. So with that being said, um, yeah, I'll work with those business owners to determine also what the value of the business is today. So they may think they want to sell the business today, but in all reality, we kind of work those numbers backwards. So if they want to hit a certain number or around a certain selling price, there's no guarantee naturally in anything.
Right.
But if they want to be around that point, then we'll run those numbers backwards and say, well, we need to be doing this volume or this profit to kind of hit those numbers that you're wishing to seek. So things get pushed back, 2, 3 years, and to benefit the seller, hopefully.
Well, and that's exactly the kind of conversation I have with my clients is, okay, what is, at some point, people always call me because they either have a problem they're trying to solve, they don't know how to fix it. So we work on that. And then the other reason is they'll call me because they're doing relatively well, but they want to do much better and they're not sure how. And in all those conversations, we always end up talking about this aspect of eventually leaving the industry. What are you going to do when you're not doing this anymore? And what's that going to cost? So when you go to sell your business, what kind of money do you need to put in your pocket to walk away from this thing? And depending on what it is you want to do, we put a number on that. And let's say the number is 5 million. They want to sell and put 5 million in their pocket. Well, all right, if your multiple is 3, then you can take 5 million divided by 3, and that's kind of where your net earnings, your EBITDA, kind of needs to be in that ballpark as a rough, as a rough end. If you want that multiple, if you think you can get that multiple to 4 or 5 or 6, then you don't need as much profit necessarily, but you need a longer term track record, and you need a lot of infrastructure in your business to make sure that it justifies the multiple. So a lot of aspects of that. Then we take, okay, what is your business worth today? Let's take that EBITDA, run it by, hit it by a certain multiple. And let's say that in this case today, the owner is the long pole in the tent. So that multiple is going to be on the low side, 2 or 3. So a business that the owner may think is worth $1 million or $2 million might be worth $500,000. I had exactly that situation with a woman who was, she was a single woman, woman-owned business, inherited it from her late husband. She was in her 60s, was kind of getting tired, wanted to retire, and thought her business was worth $1 million. And when you run the numbers, it was worth maybe a third of that. And she was really in a situation where she couldn't afford to sell the business and retire based on some other personal issues. She really needed to get it to where it would bring in $500,000 or $750,000 to be able to, for her to be able to afford to retire, because that cash out from selling the business was her retirement. She had put everything she had into the business, she and her husband. And so it's, her nest egg to live off of was a result of that sale. So we had to put together specific plans to start to drive the value of that business up, both from an earnings standpoint, a growth standpoint, and infrastructure in terms of how it was structured and set up and who she had on staff to make that business where it was more sellable, because initially it wasn't sellable because she was the business, really small business, less than $1 million a year, about $1 million a year in sales, different industry. So we had to get it where it was sellable, and we had to do all we could to drive that value up so that when she did cash out, a couple of years down the road, she actually had enough money she could probably live off of, for the rest of her years. And so that kind of discussion is something that I always get into with owners and say, okay, what's your business really worth today? What does it need to be worth 5 years, 10 years from now, whenever? And then get them thinking about, all right, here's the game plan. We got a point today. We got a game. We got a time frame, 5 to 10 years out. We've got a value today of X, and we want that value to be Y whenever we cash out. And so now we've got a beginning point, an ending point. We put together a plan to execute. And so I think it's really important to have that mindset validated by folks like you that understand it. Yeah, based on your experience selling businesses, having this infrastructure right is critical. Not being the long pole in the tent is critical. Having your regular monthly financials produced, your business that you may want to sell is separated from other business interests. Your personal life is not too tied up in the business. All these things kind of come together to basically say, hey, treat your business like a vehicle to get you from where you are today to where you want to be when you're not doing this anymore.
Yeah, there's a lot of value that you have to offer there too, helping business owners in this space by doing that. I mean, really making them sit down and think about that process, and then what's their position within the business currently, how much debt are they in the business, and then what is their business worth, and then what are they able to keep after that debt, right? On the closing statement that the actual attorney or closing attorney, whenever the business does sell, what are they able to walk away with? So very important stuff that you have to offer there.
Well, and I think too, it's helpful for them to, for a prospective seller to go ahead and talk with them, even if they don't want to sell for say 5 years. we've talked about having 3 years of financials, they may say, okay, well, I don't have to start this process right now. Actually, based on our previous conversations, previous episodes, both with you and with Aaron, I think hopefully we made the case that you need to start now with whatever plans you have for selling your business, whether it's 2 years out, 5, 10 years, whatever. There's a lot to be done. I think there's actually value in actually sitting down one-on-one with a business broker, and all the things we've talked about, validate them with the broker that you may work with. Go ahead and even if you have to pay for it, have the broker do a valuation today on what your business is really worth. We got Ed and Chase sitting here chatting about this, and we had Ed and Aaron chatting about it earlier. Okay, you're the professional, you're a certified broker, so your perspective on this carries a lot more weight than mine or Aaron's. But if they're working with you or working with another broker, going ahead and getting that valuation today to confirm, yeah, today's market, to condition of my business today, it's actually worth X. Can I afford to sell it and take that out? Is that going to work out for me, or do I need to make plans to do something different? So I think that's a really good starting point, is call a broker now and have that conversation.
Yeah, I consider it a physical for the business, and I think that it's necessary. I would say, at least every 5 years, right? Depending on what your true goals are with the business. I mean, if you want to sell it sooner, naturally, quite a bit sooner.
Yeah.
If you want to do a 5-year plan, maybe it's good to keep up with it at least every year, where you can see the differences. But even if you have no intentions of selling whatsoever, I would say, a 3 to 5 year physical of the business is definitely worth knowing from your standpoint. And again, that's just to know what you're working towards, what goals you've set, what the profit percentages are within the business, and even compared to gross revenue percentages. What can you do to make a difference? And then how are you actually analyzing each line item by line item in the profit and loss report and comparing the actual percentages to the last 3 years? And go, oh my gosh, this expense went up dramatically, and just the opposite for this expense. So just to analyze that from that standpoint, it's really worth a lot, I think.
I agree 100%. And we've all these conversations have been around the assumption that you'll sell your business at some point. I think all this still applies if the exit strategy is to transfer the ownership of the business to your kids or your brother-in-law or whomever. There's still the need for everything we've talked about, even in that type of exit strategy as well. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I do.
Cool. Obviously, as you get into business valuation, there are some more details, technical things we can get into. A lot of other things to consider, kind of beyond the scope of a podcast that's going to be 30, 40 minutes long. If they wanted to get in touch with you and talk about some of those details, to do maybe a preliminary evaluation, how could they get in touch with you, Chase?
Yeah, so my email, let's start out with my phone number. My phone number is 573-664-0002. And my email is my name, Chase Busenbark. That's Busenbark @fcbb.com. And be more than happy to walk you through that valuation and give you any points and tips or tricks on that would help you potentially increase the value of the business, or at least what to expect from the standpoint it's at right now.
Okay, good. Appreciate that. As we start to kind of wrap this up, I'm wondering if you've got any thoughts about, once somebody has sold their business, what now?
Well, it's a big decision to sell a business, especially if if it's been part of the family, or you've held on to it for a long time. And what now is you should have that answer before thinking about selling your business. You should know what your plans are, or what you plan to do with your time, or maybe even still work with the business. You're just not the owner of the business anymore. Whatever that case may be, it's definitely good to have that plan in place, because life's going to change for you quite a bit. You used to be super busy, owner operating the business. People are calling you. It's a part of your identity, and now you don't have that anymore.
Yeah, I agree 100%. That's and talking with Aaron Crowley, his situation was a little different. He owned several businesses, and he had one, the no lift install cart that he has developed and produces, that he felt like really was going to take off, and he couldn't split his time and attention between the two businesses. So he already had something to go to, but he made the comment that people that he's talked to, there's this whole concept of seller's remorse is real. If you haven't planned to sell your business to go to something, if you're in a situation, on the other hand, where you're selling your business just because you're burned out, you're fried, you got to get out of it, now you're running away from something, then I think you're out. You're what you just said about the business being your identity. You're running away from that, and then 6 months to a year down the road, it's like, wait a minute, what did I do? Why? What am I going to do now? I actually know a guy that was a client that built fiberglass center console fishing boats. That 16 to 26 foot kind of range. Not the real big expensive ones. Of course, they did some expensive ones too, I think, down the road. But he sold out prior to the recession to one of the big conglomerates, and I think he was probably in his 40s when he sold. And I ran into him a few years ago, and he was back in the same business. He had bought that brand from the conglomerate, and I said, dude, you cashed out, you got the brass, and he got some good money. He got a really good chunk of change for his business. And I said, what are you doing back in this thing again? He said, man, there's only so much hunting and fishing one man can do in his life. He thought he had the plan worked out. And so I think, as you said, that I'll use the Stephen Covey phrase, begin with the end in mind. Think about where it is you're going to, have that plan, and realize that even though you got a plan, just like this guy who had the boat business had a great plan. And, at some point things change, people change, we grow. So be prepared for that. And hopefully you've got something that you're running towards when you're selling your business, and you're not trying to run away from something.
Absolutely. I agree. You got to have a plan, but and if you've done something for so long, sometimes you get burnt out on doing the same thing for so long. And I think that's the number one reason that a business owner would consider to sell, is because they just want to change at pace. They want to change in life. It's still good to have that plan, even though you are burnt out on what you're doing, or what have you. But yeah, I've also worked with business owners that they just want to sell the current business that they have in the granite industry in one location and move to a different state and potentially buy a different shop in that state. And whether that is because they have family in that location, or it's a different climate, they just need a change of pace. They just want to kind of reset. They want to start over. But their plan is to, in a couple of years from now, I'll try and buy another shop. I'll take a year off and then hopefully buy another shop in that area that I live in.
Yep. That's even though Aaron Crowley had someone that he was going to, he said one mistake he made looking back on it, he wished he had planned more downtime between the two, because he literally sold the business, the end of one week, and Monday morning he was full time in the other business, and that was what he wanted to do, but he wished he'd kind of had a break, because as we all know, this particular industry can be a bit of a challenge. I talk to people all the time that've got burnout. I have conversations with people that sometimes are literally in tears because of the stress. And so I think if you're in that situation and that's driving your potential sale of the business, give yourself a break, take a vacation, do something, get the stress level down so that you can make a good, sensible plan that's driven by facts and not driven by emotion, because that I think can put you in a tough spot. I've talked to some folks who've sold at the wrong time, sold for the wrong reasons, didn't have a plan, running away from stress. That doesn't optimize your return on your business. Chase, I really appreciate all the time that you spent with us. Appreciate the information you've shared with us. Hopefully folks will reach out to you if they've got questions. You got any closing thoughts as we wrap up this podcast series?
A lot to think about, and it's a lot of preparation, and you won't realize the amount of preparation that it is until until you really are truly prepared to sell. So, as we've stressed many times, preparation starting right now is to prepare you for the sale whenever it does come. So
I agree. I think
that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. That's one of the things that Aaron talked about. Even though he had all of his financials, had all of his paperwork, he said that the process of selling the business was almost like taking on another full-time job. And it took him 6 months to work with a very willing and ready buyer. It was not contentious at all. It just took that long with all the documentation. So starting to prepare now is key, because he said, man, if he hadn't done the preparation, he said there's no way he'd have survived that whole process. It would just been too tough to go through all of that. But it had a huge negative impact. So yeah, I think preparation.
It takes a ton of time. I think, from a commission standpoint, a lot of business owners may look at it like, man, 8%, depending on the value, the size of the business and everything else. That's a ton of money that a broker, would receive for that. But the behind the scenes time that really goes into the process and the selling the business and the inquiries of people that, are tire kickers that you spend on the phone for hours, and all of a sudden you don't hear from them again from a broker standpoint. Um, and to kind of give you an example of that, yesterday, I just got off the phone with a guy that's been selling businesses for 20 years, and he very nice business. He had worked. It took about, I guess, 9 to 10 months before they got, the true offer, put everything in place, and it was 3 months in escrow. And a week before the closing date on a multi-million-dollar business, the buyer backed out. It just didn't end up pulling the trigger on the business. So here
Wow.
it's 11 months into this process. It's so much time and energy and countless hours of paperwork transferred back and forth, and then the buyer gets cold feet a week before. So it can be stressful at times, and I think that's, as a business owner that's truly looking to sell, I think that's probably the biggest reason to use a broker, just as a professional, to get the offers, but not only to get the offers, but to put in that time to get to the closing table, hold the deal together, um, have the experience of what to expect, and then also, have someone working for you on that behalf while you're still operating and running the business. And as you can imagine, if that business owner put in a couple hundred hours, or 100 hours into the selling process, more than that, and you're going to end up being a couple hundred hours into the actual selling process of the business, you lose your focus on running the business, because you're like, oh, this is what's most important. I want to sell my business. This is where I'm going to focus my attention. And then the deal falls apart. Now you have now you have two problems. You still don't have a sold business, and your business is probably, gone down a little bit in the terms of you losing focus and not maintaining that focus on the business.
100%. That was exactly some advice that somebody gave Aaron early in his process. Because people, a buyer can walk out at the last minute. And I think too, this whole concept of having something that you're moving towards rather than something you're moving away from. I think if you're in a situation where you're just trying to get out of the business, cash out what you can just to get rid of the stress, it's really easy when you think you've got this thing sold to start to back off and not pay attention to the details of running the business. And as you said, the business can start to suffer as a result of that. And if for some reason the sale falls through, now you've still got to try to sell your business, and you got to try to fix what you hadn't been working on the last few months. So yeah, I think that's really good advice. Chase,
And I think that even applies to the employees as well. The employees, they can kind of read the boss or the business owner, if you will, and see how much dedication and effort they're putting into the business. And if they're used to seeing one thing and all of a sudden that drops off quite a bit, then it's something that they can kind of read from that perspective too. So
they
something to
certainly
consider.
can. Yeah, that's something we haven't talked about. Is how to handle your employees. Fortunately, we had an episode with Aaron where that's all we talked about. It wasn't a long episode, but talked about how they handle employees, and you've got a certain amount of confidentiality early in the process, and then at some point, you've got to start dealing with employees and the fact that the whole situation could change during a sale. So yeah, I think that's certainly something to consider. Again, if you're running towards something, it's easier to plan for that sort of thing. If you're running away from something, it's easy to let that slide, and then things can get really ugly real quickly. So I think that's good advice. So Chase, thanks for all your time. I appreciate the experience and the knowledge you've shared with us. Hopefully it's been beneficial for our listeners. They've got your contact information. Folks, if you're listening, you think about you want to sell your business anytime in the future, talk to a broker, give Chase a call, pick his brain, find out what he can tell you. Go ahead and get a preliminary evaluation on your business so that you know where you are today. That's your starting point. And then as you start putting together exit strategy, now you've got a yardstick. You can start to measure your progress towards that. So Chase, thanks again. And folks, thank you for listening. Hope this is helpful for you. And until next time, happy fabricating. So that's our third and last episode with Chase Busenbark. Hopefully you found that information helpful. This also wraps up our 6-part series on selling your business. Again, the reason that we do these podcasts is to provide information that's hopefully helpful for you. And a lot of folks think at some point they want to get out of the business and they want to sell it and put that cash in their pocket and go do some different things, go do some great things, or retire. I think going through these podcast episodes hopefully will give you a good idea of the realities of that process, the realities of some of the financial considerations, and hopefully give you some good food for thought. If you found this helpful, let us know. We're always happy to hear from our listeners. You can contact me at ed@fabricatorscoach.com. You can go check out fabricatorscoach.com to download some free tools and things to help you out. But we always love to hear from you.